Hey everyone, I'm going to stand up because I'll probably move around so I can point out a little bit on the projection behind us. But first I do want to thank very much Councilmember Jackson and his team for taking the time tonight, and for all of our elected officials, Congressman Randall, Councilmember Rodriguez, State Senator Espeon, and our new assemblyman. So thank you for being here. We're glad to be here. And on behalf of myself and all of my colleagues at Columbia University, we're happy to spend this beautiful Friday night with you. And I want to, before I start, let me first introduce myself formally. I'm Joe Iannuso. I'm the Executive Vice President for University Facilities, and I've been at Columbia for quite some time, and I've had the pleasure of spending quite some time in several rooms with some of you over the course of the last 2 years or so. I want to underscore one thing that Councilmember Jackson said at the beginning, and he wants to be very sure that everyone has the opportunity to really understand the overview of the project. So I'm going to cover some ground for some of you. As I look around this room, we've gone through some of this information together before, so I want to apologize in advance if you've heard this, and if it's new to you, then hopefully it'll be fresh. But we're also going to cover some ground that we have not covered in previous presentations. So we'll get to that, and hopefully for those of you who've been through this from the beginning, there'll be some fresh information as well. One other just small point that I want to make with respect to the packet of materials that Councilmember Jackson and his team passed out, and Assemblyman Linares just made the point about Columbia putting in writing. One of the letters that are in there, and I'll make this point a little bit later in the presentation, is actually a letter that I signed and sent to the chairperson of CB12 immediately after the land use meeting, which was the CB12 land use meeting, which was on October 6th. And the letter is dated October 20th, and that should be in the packet that you have as well. So Columbia has put in writing a lot of the programs and services that we've heard in several of the community meetings, and I'm going to underscore that as we go through. So let me just jump to the first slide and walk you through just a quick agenda. Clearly, we're going to go through an overview of the project, and again, I think this is, I actually thought, Senator, I thought that you were going to do my presentation when we got started. We touched on all the issues that we have to cover. It's called Vision, and probably doing a little bit of your homework. So, but I think that as I was listening to you, I think that we're going to touch on all those points. And at the end of this presentation, Councilmember Jackson wanted to make sure that we had time for questions and answers. So I'm going to go through the presentation and then really turn it over to Councilmember Jackson and to you so that we'll have a chance to respond to specific questions. I'm going to go through the land use actions. Zoning in New York City, as you all know, is a highly technical process, and make sure that we are clear about the specific land actions that are underway. Talk about the Boathouse Marsh project itself, and in doing that, address some of the environmental issues that have come up. And in looking specifically at the maps, I'll also have the opportunity to look at the land area itself, for which there have been some questions. What is Columbia land? What is city land? How does that all come together in what we refer to as Boathouse Marsh? And then review the public process. So while we talk about the last 2 years, when we started meeting formally in September 2009, really give you a sense of what have happened in those meetings, the number, the range of those meetings, all of which that have led us here tonight. Okay? So we're going to cover a lot of ground. Some of it will be technical, but we also want to make sure that we have a chance to just have a little bit of dialogue and answering questions. So let me start with an overview of the immediate area, and this is probably very familiar to all of you. This is Bakersfield, Broadway, 218th Street, and the Spike Revival, which in a sense creates the northern edge of Bakersfield. For those of you who are the land use people in the room, Bakersfield is a single zoning lot, but it has 2 owners, and I'll clarify that in a little bit. But if you're familiar with the Allen Hospital is technically part of the single zoning lot, but it is a separate owner. Okay, and I'll get into some of the underlying gross square footage of land area. It's also in the packet. We do have, what Councilmember Jackson is mentioning, some of these aerials are actually in the packet that you have. There's a 1-page description of the Bakersfield project, and then it's followed by a series of maps and renderings. Immediately to the south, on south of 218th Street, it's the same underlying zoning as exists on Bakersfield. I believe it's R72, which is a residential district. And immediately on the east side of Broadway, it is an M11 district, which is a low-density manufacturing district. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. The next slide just zooms in to the Bakersfield campus itself. Again, the quick orientation of Broadway, 218th Street, the Spike Dival on the north, and of course the Water's Edge on the west, which is really part of the area that we're talking about. While I'm here, I do want to point out and underscore that Columbia University's teaching spaces on the Morningside campus and on the Medical Center campus, Morningside campus, the heart of which is at 116th Street in Broadway, the Medical Center campus is at 168th Street. Here at Bakersfield, we use this as the space for our varsity intercollegiate athletics. So we have 14 teams, 7 men and 7 women, that support all of the core athletics programs for the university. And the first thing that you notice when you look at this site is there's not a lot of buildings on the site. It's primarily fields. There is this building here, but again, that's the Allen Hospital. So it is really a separate part, single zoning lot, but really separate part and functions very separately. Soccer field, field hockey, softball, baseball, football, tennis, and I'm going to talk about the tennis bubble to make sure that we clarify any misunderstandings in that process. The build structure here is Christie Fieldhouse. It was built in 1954. It's about 34,000 square feet. And for all of the athletics programs, all 14 teams, all of the support for those teams are run out of this 34,000 square foot building. Coaches' offices, training facilities, student study spaces. We have community members come and vote during the right seasons because we want to help turn out the vote to support our democratic right and our local elected officials. So we try to leverage that 34,000 square feet as best as we possibly can. And it is, in fact, that limitation that led to the university's desire to build another building of 47,700 square feet. And I'm going to cite that on this map for you. So in the context of the campus, we're talking about one building, and currently at the intersection of 218th Street and Broadway, if you're familiar with the area, there's basically a one-story structure, mostly concrete, CMU, cinder block, that we use as a storage facility for the equipment that tends to the fields. It's really all that's in there. In that same footprint, which is right on the corner, that structure will come down. And if you're familiar with the roadway entry to Bakersfield, the building will basically consume the space that will be south of the soccer field and come from Broadway up about to the roadway, the existing roadway. We're not going to change the existing roadway into the campus, okay? So we're talking about building one building. It is estimated at about 47,700 square feet. We hired terrific architect, Stephen Hull, who does fabulous buildings all over the world, but quite frankly hasn't worked a lot in New York. So we hired Stephen to envision the building here. Now the way zoning works, especially on this particular lot, and Councilmember Rodriguez asked a question, I think, about were permits or anything necessary to build. In order to build this building, technically within New York City zoning, it would be known as an as-of-right building. Meaning we've designed the building such that it doesn't require any zoning variances. So no variance for height, no variance for setback. We're not trying to build a bigger building than what we're allowed on that site. That's part of the answer. It's not a complete answer though. Because the reality is, in order to build, the university must first resolve its obligations under waterfront zoning. So it's one zoning lot, and it is immediately on the waterfront, so it's a waterfront zoning lot. So before we can add square footage to the campus, we have to make sure that we resolve our commitments and obligations under waterfront zoning. Waterfront zoning was enacted by the city in 1993. Okay? So if the university is not building, and we have not built at Bakersfield in quite some time, then we wouldn't be here having this conversation, right? It's because the university is interested in adding square footage to the zoning lot that necessitates making sure that we resolve the waterfront zoning obligations. And I can assure the public in this room that your elected officials have been taking copious notes, and they're doing their homework, and they're asking the right questions, both to us and the other city agencies. And I think in the course of that this project has been improved. And I'm going to try to highlight that for you a little bit. So again, we move from here down to the west side of the campus, and what the university has done in looking at the land area, and the community board and the land use committee in particular, I think did an amazing piece of work and certainly understand the underlying zoning. And what the community board, and I think on some level, with great precision, has said, okay, we've done our math, and we'll dispute the math a little bit. But the basic framework of the math is, if you look at the size of the zoning lot, Columbia would be required to, based on the zoning code, to provide 15% of the land area and put it in public use. And that is, in fact, exactly what the code says. However, there's a next sentence, and the next sentence says that the applicant is certainly eligible, able to request that City Planning Commission modify the requirement for 15% and take into consideration existing structures, pre-existing structures. In this case, that would be fields and the Christie Field House, and topology, right? The natural shape of the land. So while we're looking down on this land, it actually looks like a very flat site. And those of you who are familiar with it know that it moves a bit. It's certainly a higher elevation here than it is in the water. The land actually slopes from 218th Street. It actually runs towards the water, if you will. But there are different elevation points. So when we take a look at the entire zoning lot, 15% would have said that the university needs to provide 180,000 square feet, right? So we could reduce that 180 and say, yes, that's true, but of the land area, the hospital is here. The hospital really isn't part of Columbia University. And we could have that conversation, and we have in many of our smaller meetings. That would reduce the requirement not from 180 to 5,000, but from 180 to 150,000. All right, just to do the math together. The land area that Columbia is improving is about 43,000 square feet. And we're going to get to the math. I think Senator Esquiat wanted to make sure that we clarify the difference between the land, and we're going to do that, okay? Here's one little piece of waterfront zoning that I want to make sure that we identify, and that is the last part of waterfront zoning is what's called view corridors. And the objective of view corridors, which are also part of the waterfront zoning that was made into legislation in 1993, is that the view corridors, which essentially continue from the streets on the south. The view corridors, the intent is to preserve the view corridors so that you could stand on the sidewalk and see the water. Now, because of the typology, because of the terrain change, you don't actually see the water, but nonetheless, our objective and our obligation is to try to keep those view corridors as clear as possible. Now again, because the law was enacted in 1993, any structures that were there before 1993 are grandfathered, right? They don't have to move. That being said, over time, we've actually cleared out some small structures that have existed in those view corridors over time. Okay? So let me move on to the land use actions in particular, and say we have this conversation about the 15%. Thanks. We have the conversation about the 15%, and I explained that what the legislation provides for is the land area, 15%. You can then take a look at the existing buildings and the typology, and you then have to provide the greatest land area possible to meet the obligation. But in order to do that, you have to talk to city planning and go through this process to say, we can't meet the 15%, but what we are trying to do is this. So we ask for a modification to say, we have a plan, and while it is less than the 15% for these reasons, we want to make sure that we're providing the highest quality space possible. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the deeper overview of the Marsh Project itself. The second is city planning has very specific guidelines with respect to when you calculate the area that's being improved. There are very specific requirements for how much lighting, how many linear feet of benches, how many bicycle parking, all of these specific technical details, all of which have to be addressed. And even though, in number, we may be meeting those correct numbers, because part of the area that's being improved is not university property, but city property, and I'll go through that, hopefully clearly, then we have to actually ask for a modification, because in particular areas we may not be meeting the specific number of whether it's bike racks or any of the other specific elements. Okay? But I'll try to clarify that a little further as well. All right, so back to this. Land area, 15%, two really zoning modification requests. One on total size of land area that's being improved, and the area being improved is identified down here on the western edge. And the other is the specific design requirements with respect to design elements that city planning cares very deeply about, and I would say that they care deeply about them for all of our benefit, because they worry about things that we don't necessarily worry about, but we appreciate when they're done in the right way. So let me move on to the marsh itself. This is one of the first site plans that we used, and we used them in public meetings, when we conceived of the idea, the concept, for how we may be able to take the land area that we believe that the university could improve and put into public use. And this was the first map that we put out there. And I just want to orient you a little bit and clarify for you. Then what I'd like to do is to try to identify things that we've heard from you, things that we've heard from the local elected officials that have led to improvements in this plan. And if I miss anything along the way, I'm confident that you're going to point that out, and we'll make sure that we haven't missed anything. This is 218th Street. Again, Broadway would be all the way down on the other side of the room. This is the water's edge. One thing I want to point out here with respect to the property that is or isn't Columbia's property is, have any of you seen this before? Just a show of hands? Okay. Let me point out a couple of things, because this has been out there for quite some time, but that's something that we always understand, sort of the